Historical narration of the wonderful footsteps of divine providence in erecting, carrying on, and building the orphan house and other charitable institutions at Glaucha near Hull in Saxony, without any visible fund to support it, by Augustus Hermann Francke, Professor of Divinity in the Friedrichshain University of Hull, pastor of Glaucha, and director of the Pious Foundation there. Continuing to the beginning of the year 1702, in a letter to a friend, and in appendix giving a more clear and full view of the progress of learning in Christian piety, both in the said university and the Royal Collegial Schools, in which is added several considerable papers relating to this work written by the King of Prussia. London, printed in 1705. This is being read by Peter John Paresis. The author's dedication to all such benefactors as have been or shall be influenced by the powerful operation of God's Spirit to exert their bounty and charity in making provision for the poor and in taking care of the education of youth, the only end thereof is the edification and improvement of the spiritual house of God, for the furthering whereof in this time of decay there is a necessity of some outward assistance, whether they contribute for the attainment of that great good by an actual supply of external relief, or by devout addresses to the throne of grace, by good advice, by personal labors, or by kind intercessions with others, or by any other means of what qualify, rank, condition, or character soever, from the highest to the lowest, and what place soever they reside, known or unknown. This present large narrative of the hospital and the other Christian schools erected for the foundation of South Glaucha without Hull is dedicated and presented with most profound submission and humble respect, according to their several dignities, and with just gratitude to all, and with hearty desire that the same God, who hath hitherto in the management of this work so plainly manifested the impressions of his providence and the riches of his mercy towards such as trust in him, may condescend and continue to be their God, their shield, and their exceeding great reward, now and forever, delivering them in the time of trouble, preserving them and keeping them alive, blessing them upon the earth, not delivering not them the will of their enemies, strengthening them upon the bed of languishing, making their bed in their sickness, and receiving them into his favor and protection here and into his glorious presence hereafter, as they have received and do receive Christ in his members, and opening his heart to them as they have opened theirs to their fellow creatures, and granting them boldness before his tribunal, together with them who are already rest in the Lord, and setting them to judge the world, whose perverse creature could not restrain them from the practice of charity and benevolence, being in the meantime assured of the consistent intercession of the authors, more poor clients, orphans, and widows, before the mercy seat of God, who remains with sincere acknowledgments of the benefits already conferred or hereafter to be conferred on the poor, most submissive, most obedient, and most obsequious to them all, with due respect to their several characters of distinctions. Glaucha without Hull, March the 31st, 1701. Augusto Hermann Francke. The Preface to the English Reader. There have appeared in our language several books, some years since, setting forth the piety and charity exercised in Roman Catholic countries, in particular in some of the most famous cities of that religion, with all possible advantage, as Pietas, and then Romana, printed at Oxford, Pietas, and then Parifiensis at Paris, and wherein it has been insinuated that charity is a mark of the Catholic Church, exclusive to all other churches, by the Catholic always understanding the Roman Church, and the Protestants are thence invited to reunite themselves to a church which seems to carry such fair pretensions to the fruit of this divine grace, whence also a book is initiated. The Spirit of Christianity, written with this very purpose, was printed in London in 1686, being dedicated to King James II. 'Tis not in opposition to these, which may not perhaps have a little contributed to the provoking of some Protestants piously disposed to adorn their religion with good deeds and to confederate themselves together, even for this end, without going at all over either to the Church or Court of Rome, but purely for the excitement of the true, genuine spirit of Christianity among such as may have a great deal more of it than those they have left, that this description of the pious charity lately set on foot in and about the Hall of Saxony, and an illustrious Protestant university, founded by his present Prussian Majesty, is made to speak English and faithfully communicated under the title of capital Pietas, capital Hallensis, which, not being drawn from the original, but superadded to it on special consideration, the reader is hereof in the first place admonished that he may not take in any sinister impression thence, as if the author had an over-fondness or valuation for the foundations by him set up. Number 2. This little historical piece of indubitable truth is, for the subject matter of it, far more considerable than many will be apt to imagine or believe at first, and fairly accounts, I think, for one of the greatest transactions at this day in the world, which, if it proceeds as it has hitherto done, will in a very few years come to have a much greater influence in the public affairs of Europe than all the battles and sieges with which our gazettes, mercuries, and registers are filled. And this coming to us from a nation from whom we derive both our pedigree and religion, together with many of our ancient laws and political establishments, and with whom also our alliances at this instant are such as ought to make us now and never somewhat inquisitive for certain into their affairs and acts, as these have both always had a near influence on ours, both in church and state, in peace and war, and as they must have more so now, in all probability, whether according to the present crisis of Christendom in general, or that of this kingdom in particular, cannot be unworthy the inquiry and consideration of all sorts of persons among us, high and low, rich and poor, learned and unlearned, conformist and dissenter, or occasional conformist, since all may equally reap the advantage of it, if they refuse not. For as the matter herein treated and exemplified is of most universal concern, and fitly adapted to the conservation of kingdoms and states, and the prosperity of all orders and ranks in them respectively, so ought none to think themselves herein perfectly unconcerned. Nay, were there nothing but curiosity only to invite any to the persuading of these sheets, the relation which they contained is so strange and rare as might well command this, if it be not a very visited curiosity indeed. Number 3. The author's introduction will sufficiently acquaint the reader how this description or narrative came to be drawn up, and how far authority is concerned in it. Also, forasmuch as the matters of fact and the whole method of this new and surprising institution have been by the sovereign command laid before and strictly examined by the Lord's commissioners delegated for the visitation, there can be no manner of doubt but that the account is exact. The acceptation it has already met with in neighboring countries, having been several editions within a very few years in High and Low Dutch, and the effects it has produced might be enough, if not more than enough, to recommend the same to all the lovers of truth, especially to as many as are inspired with a zeal for the promotion of solid piety and charity by the societies for that end set up lately within these kingdoms or any otherwise. As for the author, he is too well known to have much said of him, and too modest to bear what might deservingly be said of him on this head, as desires what God alone may have the glory of this whole work. And indeed, to the glory of God and of the Christian religion, it may be said that in these later ages there can be nothing found yet, on all accounts, to parallel with it, notwithstanding all the magnificent and sumptuous charities any were extended in the Christian world, as by comparing the several accounts together may easily be made to appear. Number 4. However, it cannot be expected but our modern atheists, deists, and libertines will venture here to banter at their cost all what their principles will not allow them to account for. But if the traces of a God be to be discerned even in his more common providence and the ordinary works of his hands, as several able pens have invincibly made out against these skeptical gentlemen, surely they are not least but more discernible in his uncommon providences, such as these herein related, and in the more extraordinary works of his faithfulness and parental care here attested authentically, wherein all things considered and compared as they ought, this will effectually be found a demonstration of his footprints of the divine being in the world, though not perhaps to the convincing of those that are resolved to the contrary, which is not to be regarded. 'Tis enough that it is so to such as have no aversion to the truth, and for certain that loving demonstration, which is by sensible experience, falls no way short of those which are called mathematical or metaphysical, nay, it even transcends them by the confession of some that must be allowed to be no incompetent judges of this case. I say the living experimental demonstration of a deity and of a divine providence, such as may have been found reportedly nakedly and simply, transcends every evidence whatever which is merely speculative and affects but the understanding, and that perhaps as much as the most vivid sensation of the light and heat of the sun does surpass any dry speculation of the same, however otherwise fine. Number 5. Here it may not be unfit possibly to let the reader know in short that there is a twofold divine testimony which has been particularly in several treatises considered by our author. These are the Word and the Work of God. In the year 1702 he published a collection of tracts, 6 in number, under the title of the Testimony of the Word of God, and in the same year also under the collection under that of the Testimony of the Work of God, in which this, that is here translated, is the first inscribed, the Footsteps of God. The general title prefixed to this last collection, pinned at Hall under the author's name and customary titles, is as follows, viz. His public testimony of the works of God, both in maintaining the poor, as also in the education and information of youth to the glory of God, and to the service of the Christian magistrates, ministers, directors of the schools, private schoolmasters, tutors, and parents, as also in general of as many as acknowledge and lament that destruction of the poor and of the youth which so mightily prevails, and do really endeavor by God's grace to redress the same as much as in them is possible, comprising into several treatises, being for the same end orderly compiled and partly enlarged, but for the most part published for the first time, with the privileges of his high majesty of Poland, as also of Prussia, and the electors of Saxony, and Brandeben BONRGH. The particular title, as in this edition, literally, according to the original, will run thus, viz., The Footsteps of the Yet Living, Governing, Loving, and Faithful God, for the confusion of unbelievers and the confirmations of believers, by a full description of the hospital, poor schools, and other charitable provisions at GLAUCHA by Hall, declaring how the same has been carried on till Easter in the year 1702. Not long after which was printed there also an edition in the High Dutch answering to this, there having been another printed some time before at Amsterdam, and called A Short Description of the Hospital, lately erected at Hall, in the Dukedom of Magdeburgh, showing how the same was begun, and in what condition it is at present, to the praise of God's faithful providence in the strengthening of a dependency on Him, and to an excitement of true Christian charity. Written in High Dutch by A.H. Francke, professor in the Greek and Oriental languages, together with two annotations for the collector, done out in High into Low Dutch. This is in 12 and the other in quarto. The rest of the pieces which make up this collection and prosecute the same design with this that is now Englished may successively follow hereafter. End of Part 1. Historical narration of the wonderful footsteps of divine providence in erecting, carrying on, and building the orphan house and other charitable institutions at GLAUCHA near Hall in Saxony, without any visible fund to support it, by Augustus Hermann Francke, professor of divinity in the Friedrichshain University of Hall, pastor of GLAUCHA, and director of the Pious Foundation there. Continuing to the beginning of the year 1702, in a letter to a friend, and in appendix giving a more clear and full view of the progress of learning in Christian piety, both in the said university and the Royal Collegial Schools, in which is added several considerable papers relating to this work, written by the King of Prussia. London, printed in 1705. This is being read by Peter John Paresis. The author's dedication to all such benefactors as have been or shall be influenced by the powerful operation of God's Spirit to exert their bounty and charity in making provision for the poor and in taking care of the education of youth, the only end thereof is the edification and improvement of the spiritual house of God, for the furthering whereof in this time of decay there is a necessity of some outward assistance, whether they contribute for the attainment of that great good by an actual supply of external relief, or by devout addresses to the throne of grace, by good advice, by personal labors, or by kind intercessions with others, or by any other means of what qualify, rank, condition, or character soever, from the highest to the lowest, in what place soever they reside, known or unknown. This present large narrative of the hospital and the other Christian schools erected for the foundation of South GLAUCHA without Hall is dedicated and presented with most profound submission and humble respect, according to their several dignities, and with just gratitude to all, and with hearty desire that the same God, who hath hitherto in the management of this work so plainly manifested the impressions of his providence and the riches of his mercy towards such as trust in him, may condescend and continue to be their God, their shield, and their exceeding great reward, now and forever, delivering them in the time of trouble, preserving them and keeping them alive, blessing them upon the earth, not delivering not them, the will of their enemies, strengthening them upon the bed of languishing, making their bed in their sickness, and receiving them into his favor and protection here and into his glorious presence hereafter, as they have received and do receive Christ in his members, and opening his heart to them as they have opened theirs to their fellow creatures, and granting them boldness before his tribunal, together with them who are already rest in the Lord, and setting them to judge the world, whose perverse creature could not restrain them from the practice of charity and benevolence, being in the meantime assured of the consistent intercession of the authors, more poor clients, orphans, and widows, before the mercy seat of God, who remains with sincere acknowledgments of the benefits already conferred or hereafter to be conferred on the poor, most submissive, most obedient, and most obsequious to them all, with due respect to their several characters of distinctions. Gallenga without Hall, March the 31st, 1701. Augusto Hermann Francke. The Preface to the English Reader. There have appeared in our language several books, some years since, setting forth the piety and charity exercised in Roman Catholic countries, in particular in some of the most famous cities of that religion, with all possible advantage, as Pietas, and then Romana, printed at Oxford, Pietas, and then Parifiensis at Paris, and wherein it has been insinuated that charity is a mark of the Catholic Church, exclusive to all other churches. By the Catholic always understanding the Roman Church, and the Protestants are thence invited to reunite themselves to a church which seems to carry such fair pretensions to the fruit of this divine grace, whence also a book is initiated. The Spirit of Christianity, written with this very purpose, was printed in London in 1686, being dedicated to King James II. 'Tis not in opposition to these, which may not perhaps have a little contributed to the provoking of some Protestants piously disposed to adorn their religion with good deeds, and to confederate themselves together, even for this end, without going at all over either to the church or court of Rome, but purely for the excitement of the true, genuine spirit of Christianity among such as may have a great deal more of it than those they have left, that this description of the pious charity lately set on foot in and about Hall of Saxony, and an illustrious Protestant university, founded by his present Prussian Majesty, is made to speak English and faithfully communicated under the title of capital Pietas, capital Hallensis, which, not being drawn from the original, but superadded to it on special consideration, the reader is hereof in the first place admonished that he may not take in any sinister impression thence, as if the author had in over-fondness or valuation for the foundations by him set up. Number 2. This little historical piece of indubitable truth is, for the subject matter of it, far more considerable than many will be apt to imagine or believe at first, and fairly accounts, I think, for one of the greatest transactions at this day in the world, which, if it proceeds as it has hitherto done, will in a very few years come to have a much greater influence in the public affairs of Europe than all the battles and sieges with which our gazettes, mercuries, and registers are filled. And this coming to us from a nation from whom we derive both our pedigree and religion, together with many of our ancient laws and political establishments, and with whom also our alliances at this instant are such as ought to make us now and never somewhat inquisitive for certain into their affairs and acts, as these have both always had a near influence on ours, both in church and state, in peace and war, and as they must have more so now, in all probability, whether according to the present crisis of Christendom in general, or that of this kingdom in particular, cannot be unworthy the inquiry and consideration of all sorts of persons among us, high and low, rich and poor, learned and unlearned, conformist and dissenter, or occasional conformist, since all may equally reap the advantage of it, if they refuse not. For as the matter herein treated and exemplified is of most universal concern, and fitly adapted to the conservation of kingdoms and states, and the prosperity of all orders and ranks in them respectively, so ought none to think themselves herein perfectly unconcerned. Nay, were there nothing but curiosity only to invite any to the persuading of these sheets, the relation which they contained is so strange and rare as might well command this, if it be not a very visited curiosity indeed. Number 3. The author's introduction will sufficiently acquaint the reader how this description or narrative came to be drawn up, and how far authority is concerned in it. Also, for as much as the matters of fact and the whole method of this new and surprising institution have been by the sovereign command laid before and strictly examined by the Lords Commissioners delegated for the visitation, there can be no manner of doubt but that the account is exact. The acceptation it has already met with in neighboring countries, having been several editions within a very few years in High and Low Dutch, and the effects it has produced might be enough, if not more than enough, to recommend the same to all the lovers of truth, especially to as many as are inspired with a zeal for the promotion of solid piety and charity by the societies for that end set up lately within these kingdoms, or any otherwise. As for the author, he is too well known to have much said of him, and too modest to bear what might deservingly be said of him on this head, as desires what God alone may have the glory of this whole work. And indeed, to the glory of God and of the Christian religion, it may be said that in these later ages there can be nothing found yet, on all accounts, to parallel with it, notwithstanding all the magnificent and sumptuous charities any were extended in the Christian world, as by comparing the several accounts together may easily be made to appear. Number 4. However, it cannot be expected but our modern atheists, deists, and libertines will venture here to banter at their cost all what their principles will not allow them to account for. But if the traces of a God be to be discerned even in his more common providence and the ordinary works of his hands, as several able pens have invincibly made out against these skeptical gentlemen, surely they are not least but more discernible in his uncommon providences, such as these herein related, and in the more extraordinary works of his faithfulness and parental care here attested authentically, wherein all things considered and compared as they ought, this will effectually be found a demonstration of his footprints of the divine being in the world, though not perhaps to the convincing of those that are resolved to the contrary, which is not to be regarded. 'Tis enough that it is so to such as have no aversion to the truth, and for certain that loving demonstration, which is by sensible experience, falls no way short of those which are called mathematical or metaphysical. Nay, it even transcends them by the confession of some that must be allowed to be no incompetent judges of this case. I say the living experimental demonstration of a deity and of a divine providence such as may have been found reportedly nakedly and simply, transcends every evidence whatever which is merely speculative and affects but the understanding, and that perhaps as much as the most vivid sensation of the light and heat of the sun does surpass any dry speculation of the same, however otherwise fine. Number 5. Here which may not be unfit possibly to let the reader know in short that there is a twofold divine testimony which has been particularly in several treatises considered by our author. These are the Word and the Work of God. In the year 1702 he published a collection of tracts, 6 in number, under the title of the Testimony of the Word of God, and in the same year also under the collection under that of the Testimony of the Work of God, in which this, that is here translated, is the first inscribed, the Footsteps of God. The general title prefixed to this last collection, pinned at Hall under the author's name and customary titles, is as follows, viz. His public testimony of the works of God, both in maintaining the poor, as also in the education and information of youth to the glory of God, and to the service of the Christian magistrates, ministers, directors of the schools, private schoolmasters, tutors, and parents, as also in general of as many as acknowledge and lament that destruction of the poor and of the youth which so mightily prevails, and do really endeavor by God's grace to redress the same as much as in them is possible, comprising into several treatises, being for the same end orderly compiled and partly enlarged, but for the most part published for the first time, with the privileges of His High Majesty of Poland, as also of Prussia, and the electors of Saxony, and Brandenburg. The particular title, as in this edition, literally, according to the original will, run thus, viz., the footsteps of the yet living, governing, loving, and faithful God, for the confusion of unbelievers and the confirmations of believers, by a full description of the hospital, poor schools, and other charitable provisions at GLAUCHA by Hall, declaring how the same has been carried on till Easter in the year 1702. Not long after which was printed there also an edition in the High Dutch answering to this, there having been another printed some time before at Amsterdam, and called A Short Description of the Hospital, lately erected at Hull, in the Dukedom of Magdeburg, showing how the same was begun, and in what condition it is at present, to the praise of God's faithful providence in the strengthening of a dependency on Him, and to an excitement of true Christian charity, written in High Dutch by A.H. Francke, professor in the Greek and Oriental languages, together with 2 agitations for the collector, done out in High into Low Dutch. This is in 12 and the other in quarto. The rest of the pieces which make up this collection and prosecute the same design with this that is now Englished may successively follow hereafter. End of part 1. Being a historical narration of the wonderful footsteps of divine providence by Francke. Part 2 of the prefix. Number 6. Now the account of this work, which was written and published by order of the Lords of the Council, who visited the hospital and schools by a royal commission in 1700, going but very little further, the author was prevailed on by one of his foreign friends to continue his narrative of the providences of God in relation to these pious and charitable institutions, in answer to whom he write the letter which is hereto annexed. This he caused to be soon after printed, as a continuation of the former account, whereof it is also a vindication. But since this letter was written, a considerable progress has been, and is yet daily made, both in the conduct of the hospital and all the other dependent charities. Also many in other countries have been excited by it to set on foot certain good designs in order to a real reformation and the promoting of a public good, which fall not within the preface to be insisted on. But in short, the finger of God attends all what is said above for the better carrying on this undertaking. By a grant from His Prussian Majesty, the hospital is set free from all sorts of taxes and imposts. The building is much advanced and carried up higher. There are leads at the top of it for the children in clear starlight to go up to and learn astronomy. The outhouses, as its brewhouse, bakehouse, and all other offices of that nature, are so got ready as they have now everything within themselves, all necessary employments and trades being here exercised. The dispensary and laboratory are greatly improved and stocked. The press is continually employed in bringing forth good books to promote religion and learning, and the bookseller's shop already has such a vast number and choices of books that it is thought able to use with any in the whole university and city. Number 7. The flourishing state of the schools, both for boys and girls, is almost incredible. At the last examination of youth in the orphan house, the grace of God has not been only joyfully taken notice of in the growth of Christian piety and good learning in the children, but also that the number of the boys and girls together did amount to 673. Of these part are taught gratis, after an easy and pleasant manner, and part are fully maintained in clothing, clothbing, and diet. Some of the orphans who were poor vagrants, when taken into the hospital, have arrived to so much learning during their stay in it as to be thought sufficiently qualified for academic studies. And accordingly 4 have been singled out last summer from among the rest for that purpose. And from the first beginning of these things 10 years ago, it is computed that in the month of March this year there had been educated 304 boys and 89 girls, making together the sum of 393, in which space of time there have died out of this number 26 boys and 6 girls, and of the boys 72 have been disposed of to trades and manual occupations, but of the girls 22. That is about a 4th part of the one and the other. Number 8. The number of poor students and children together in the hospital is now at this time increased to above 700. The students have their diet in the hospital being maintained out of the common stock, which still depends on God's providence, without any settled provision. There are several exercises and works distributed among these for the good of the public. Particularly, there are 12 students under the inspection and government of the learned Professor Michaelis and his adjuncts, constantly employed in the collecting and fitting out in Hebrew Bible, which may be ready by the next year, and is promised to be exacter than any now extent, for which they are not wanting of some particular advantages. All this is projected by Professor Francke, who has gotten an house on purpose for those that are instructing with this affair, they lodging all together in the same house. Number 9. Nothing can be more regular than the chamber of correspondences and the special assignments of the several students therein concerned, according to the best reports which arrived thence. It was begun for keeping up a familiar commerce and communion with some foreign and Christian friends for the propagating true Christian knowledge and practice, and hitherto has been continued not without a blessing. And all those that will communicate any accounts to them at Hale of what may happen and serve for the edifying benefit and improvement of their neighbors, and is worthy of the aforementioned correspondence, shall by so doing oblige many good friends, to which they are invited at this present by a sort of general circular letter, with which there is a project of specimen of the design added, containing many curious particulars and weighty transactions. Number 10. Moreover, there is lately set up a free table for such poor students as do not belong to the hospital and often know not where to get a meal's meat, who, if they repair hither at the appointed time, will be sure not to miss of a dinner. This is called the MENSA externordina, which is constantly frequented. Number 11. Sense which also for the better maintaining of poor students in the FRIDERICIAN University at Hale, and for making it yet more flourishing besides the free tables of the Dukedom of Magdeburg and Halberstadt, and what is done for these indigent students at the orphan house or hospital towards their maintenance, it has been by His Precious Majesty most graciously provided and ordered that for obtaining the aforesaid end there shall be established a public community or convictorium for poor students, which new order and institution is sent sealed to the said University of Hale in order it comes SIGILLO and then capital REGIO, by virtue of which in all the Prussian countries, cities, towns, and villages, and in all the dominions to him belonging, there are to be put out plates before all and every church 4 times a year, namely on the first Sunday or holy day of the quarter, to gather a collection for such a free table of community, which shall always be imitated before the pastors or ministers on the Sunday immediately preceding the said collection. And indeed Hull is at this time, though of so late a foundation, the most flourishing in all Germany. And the conflux of students as well from all parts of Germany as from neighboring countries is so great that according to the exactest computation, the number of them amounts to above 3,000. Number 12. The capital PAEDAGOGIUM, which is an institution by itself not relating to the hospital, was first set up as a private concern by Professor Francke, but has since been taken into consideration by His Prussian Majesty, being now called the PAEDAGOGIUM, and then capital REGIUM. In the paying a moderate rate, children and youth are fundamentally instructed in the principles of true Christianity and are prepared for academic studies by a familiar and delightful institution of them, not only in the dead and living languages, but also in geography, history, arithmetic, geometry, anatomy, astronomy, and such other arts and sciences as they are capable of in their more tender years. Of this there has been set forth a large and very particular account in a book of this author called The Order and Method of Teaching, introduced in the Pagdagomen at Gloucester near Hull. Number 13. Not only in the hospital, but also in other places in the suburbs of Hull, several schools have been opened and kept up to this very day, wherein both citizens and strangers' children have been instituted according to the model contrived by Mr. Francke, part of Gracious, and the rest at a low rate. 8 of these schools are annexed to the hospital, in all which there have been hitherto educated no less than 1,645. Which if you shall add the number of those bred in the orphan house or hospital, which is said to be 393, the whole sum will arise to 2,038, so that upwards of 2,000 children, boys and girls, have been hereby provided with a good education and well instructed in the principles of true Christian knowledge, as well as made serviceable to the public. The masters who have been put over these schools are numbered to be 266. That they are set to teach in these are therefore chosen out of the number of students, that by the same method they themselves may be better fitted and prepared for such a useful function in other places, whether they may happen to be called and may be made instrumental in bringing about hereafter with ease and dexterity a reformation of the public schools. The number of all those students who from the year 1696 had been received into the hospitals and there fed arises to 464. Number 14. Now the project of the manner of the education herein, as also in the schools belonging to the orphan house, having been early communicated both in Holland and England, it would not be difficult to give an account of some considerable fruits thereby produced in both these countries, and which daily do increase more and more to God's glory and the good of the public, but that we are at this time, for certain reasons, restrained from speaking more of this matter or of the several branchings from this stock, leaving the wisdom and providence of God to manifest in His time what is good in His eye, and to carry on this work, so despicable at its first beginning, to that end which is foreseen by Him. But, however, this be one thing throughout ought still to be heeded and remembered, that whereas there has been a great corruption generally in the manner of building and founding schools, hospitals, and almshouses, and many disorders committed in their management by the means of evil or ignorant stewards, all this is not only here prevented, but a great deal of good has been also actually done in other charitable foundations elsewhere, from the consideration of the regulations of GLAUCHA. For notorious it is that the endeavors of many founders and benefactors have been too much taken up with what is outward. But here there is no other regard at all to the outward, but as it may subserve the inward. They have been ordinarily more careful to provide the body with necessary maintenance in these their houses of charity than the soul would do instruction. But in this orphan house at Hall, the first and principal care of the pious instructor is to educate the orphans in true and solid piety, and to implant in them a deep fear of the Lord with their tender years, as it is likewise the method and practice of other foundations that have lately sprung up hence, and particularly at Nuremberg, Augsburg, Westphalia, Friesland, etc. Number 15. Thus much, in short, may be sufficient to have here hinted concerning the progress of this work at Hall, from the time that the account thereof given by the author himself ends, and concerning the present good estate of the several charitable foundations and institutions, and the encouragement which they now meet with under a royal nursing Father, whose heart the God of heaven has touched to consider His own and His subject truest interest, and to account in His glory to be the protector and patron of this blessed work, which, if it shall continue to be blessed of God as hitherto it hath been, is likely to prove in a short while the richest jewel in His crown. End of Part 2 of the Preface, having been read by Peter John Preface. Francke. Preface, Part 3. Number 16. And now, upon consideration of the whole, it will evidently appear that the finger of God is secretly and powerfully working at this day, that He is also raising up and inspiring public witnesses that may bear testimony both to the word and work of the day, and that the hearts of princes are in the hands of His divine majesty, as the rivers of waters, who turneth them in a moment, which way soever He pleases. So fulfill His will and His purpose, so as even not to be ashamed to patronize what may have the most mean and object original in the world. And particularly it may be hence demonstrated how much the Roman missionaries are out when they go about to confine the spirit of charity to the church. Moreover, there having not been, so far as yet appears, from the first date of the Reformation, anything that can parallel with what is here related, it is not doubted but the best of the Protestants will look on this as no mean piece of service to the cause of common Christianity, and theirs as such. For that this is such a living demonstration of the life and power of God's Spirit in many souls that have no communion with the Church of Rome, as 'twill be possible for their greatest adversaries ever to resist. 'Tis a divine axiom that God is charity, and that whosoever abides in charity abideth therefore in God, as in the divine nature and image. If therefore the Protestants, by bringing forth the fruits of charity, spiritual and corporal, can demonstrate themselves to abide in charity, or in the love of the brethren, they bring them therewith a demonstration that they abide in Christ, are in the divine communion as spiritual members of Christ and fellow members of each other. But in the present case, those fruits of charity are here demonstrated which cannot proceed but from the God of charity, and which are certain 'tis not possible as a corrupt root ever to bring forth. Number 17. It must yet acknowledged by all that in the Roman Catholic communion there are many magnificent and splendid acts of charity, which surpass all that is generally to be found among Protestants, from what root they sprang, or with what purity of innocence on them are brought or carried on, God will judge. There will always be trickling in religion and espiing the true thing. But however it may be with some, we have all the reason in the world to conclude that others in that communion have added purely on principles of genuine Christianity, notwithstanding all the difficulties and disadvantages that might otherwise labor under. Of these I shall here mention one, which comes the nearest of any that I know to the present case. It may possibly afford some light to it, and also provoke them who make possession of greater purity of religion and far greater advantages to examine themselves whether they have brought forth fruits worthy of what they possess. It is Mr. Vincent that I mean, a poor secular priest, who first began the reformation of in Italian clergy in the last century by suggesting to the then Archbishop of Paris the method of spiritual retreat for 10 days before the collation of holy orders, which has given birth to several spiritual and excellent treatises from some of the greatest persons of France for learning and piety, laid the foundation of the priests of the mission, who were to renounce all church benefices, dignities, and offices, and to apply themselves entirely and purely, without admitting of any restitution or reward in whatever kind soever, to procure the corporal and spiritual God of the poor people of the villages. Live to see who less than 24 of these foundations all over France, besides others in foreign parts, distributed his charities not only at home, but sent by his agent missionaries a very liberal assistance even to foreigners, and what is still more, enemies too, and particularly for the relief of the calamities of the Lorraine, Loraim, groaning under all the evils of war. So less than 1,600,000 livres French, taking the care at once on him of a matter of 25 towns, besides boroughs and villages, to supply of several thousand indigent inhabitants, provided the establishment of a hospital or orphan house for exposed children in order to their religious education, the revenue thereof amounting annually to 4,000 pistoles, set up the institution of the Ladies of Charity, in which were several duchesses, matriarchs, and the greatest ladies of all France. Added to this, that the maids or sisters of the charity, consisting of those of an inferior quality and related according to certain constitutions, afterwards approved by the Archbishop of Paris, and authorized and confirmed to the King's letters patents verified in Parliament, founded and established a hotel of the name Jesus for 40 old men and women decayed in the world, obtained a provision even for the galley slaves both at Paris and Marseille, and this also to be settled for perpetuity, studying by all ways and means imaginable to leave none of any rank unprovided for, according to the best of his ability and knowledge, either as to soul or body, in all things approved himself a faithful steward of the poor, even to the maintaining upon the stock of faith, without any visible fund at first, not only abundant of distressed families up and down, but even whole provinces in a manner together, as champion and Picardy, when almost quite ruinated and expiring, as it were, by the extremity of famine and sickness. Many good souls are powerfully stirred up by him, even as in our present case, who chose not to be known while they lent their assisting hand to what he had piously projected at one time. Only, we are told, there was brought to him a sum of considerable by a citizen of Paris, with an express prohibition against revealing either the person's name or the sum of it itself, as sufficient to purchase a decent habitation with a garden for 20 poor tradesmen in the suburbs of St. Lazarus, and another adjoining for so many women, and also to provide them with all manners of necessities, from which the relator infers that it could not but exceed 10,000 pistoles, a considerable sum indeed to come in from an unknown hand. And yet this, and all that has been hitherto related to the good man, is not so much to be wondered at if compared with the present undertaking here described, which has had innumerable difficulties to grasp with, beyond what the other could have, where there were but for certain many previous dispositions and preparations to facilitate the designs of the charitable director, as it would be most easy to make good. Number 18. Nevertheless, let virtue and piety, wherever they are found, have their due value, and let us not distract even from the brave actions of heathens or of enemies, but let us acknowledge in heart and deed that verily God is no respecter of persons or of outward professions and forms, as the word may well bear, however we are, but that he accepts every one that is devout according to his present light and knowledge, as was Cornelius, persisting in praying with almsgiving. Wherefore, if they that boast of a greater light and of a great privileges and advantages of the Reformation in opposition to the corruption and darkness of popery, do not let their light so shine before men as their good and charitable works may be seen to the glory of God, not to their own glory. Shall not these, whom they so much despise and condemn, stand up in judgment against them in that day when the veil of covering shall be taken away from all nations, and Christ shall lay naked the hearts of all men? And shall not they of Rome and Paris raise up and plead in that day against them that covet to be called by the name of the Reformed, Evangelical Protestants, and the like, and yet are not reformed in their manners by being transformed from the world, but are strangers to the true evangelical piety and charity, or the life of the gospel, and seem to have forgotten almost or altogether their baptismal protestation and oath against these three grand adversaries, or the triple league of hell. Yea, verily they shall raise up in judgment against us in that day, if we walk not worthy of that vocation upon which we are called in the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And it shall certainly be more tolerable for Turks and other Mohammedans, who shall have been eminent for their justice, charity, and hospitality in that day, than it shall be for the many among us Christians and such as profess also the Reformation, who study not to adore our holy religion answerably to the intent of it, of which an example is here set before our eyes by our neighbors, who have shown us their faith by their works. May we now show ours to them in like manner, that they with us and we with them may hereby glorify our Father which is in heaven. And he has been glorified indeed by that public work which is carried on in Germany, as both from this relation and others doth appear undeniably. And if in our candlestick also there were but such a light but put as in theirs, we might soon reasonably hope that it might give light unto all that are in the house of God. End of section 3 of the Preface. Be an historical narration of the wonderful footsteps of divine providence by Francke. Preface, section 4, number 19. Now, for as much as the public work of God, which has broken out so eminently of late years in and about the Royal University of Hull, as from its chief center, dispersing itself far and near, lay for some time before hidden as it were in embryo, and that there manifestly appears to have been a seed of pure Christianity gradually quickening and springing up in the midst of the Lutheran Reformation. And moreover, for as much as the greatest part of English readers are not much acquainted with what relates either to the rise or progress of these matters, how considerable soever in themselves they are, and several have desired some just account hereof, which they might rely on, it has been thought expedient to answer here, in brief, the desires and solicitations of such, by giving a faithful and simple view of this whole affair, not only in this, but also in several other provinces and circles of Germany, and pointing out the principal persons and springs that have been set on work in the propagating Christian piety and promoting a solid reformation of manners among all orders, both of the clergy and laity. Number 20. It hath been remarked by some curious observers that for some ages past, about the beginning of each century, there has happened some considerable change in the state of religion, as the motions in Germany first, and successfully in other parts, by means of Dr. Luther's Reformation soon after the beginning of the 16th century after Christ, as just 100 years before those in Bohemia by means of Huss, and another 100 backwards those in England by means of Wycliffe. So in like manner, just about 100 years after Luther, there arose near the same place and upon the same stock another Reformation, but which did not respect so much opinion as practice. This was first promoted by the most eminent and pious Dr. Gerhardt, divinity professor at Jena, that's Jena, whose great candor as well as zeal is sufficiently conspicuous both in his works and life, but chiefly by the excellent John Arden, that's Arndt, General Superintendent of the churches under the princes of, it's spelled Lunenbourgh. These two, laying deeply to heart the decay of Christian piety, were wholly taken up with the thoughts of the reviving the spirit and the life of Christianity, both among those of the Austin Confession in particular, as well as among all professed Christians in general. The latter of these by his most celebrated piece of True Christianity, published in several languages, and by that of his Garden of Practices, in confirmation of which last some things are credibly reported hardly inferior to miracles, was an instrument of the divine blessing in the conversion of many souls into the true and interior Christianity, however it happened to him, as it generally happens to all that are engaged in great and good designs. He was misunderstood, misrepresented, opposed, and vilified by many, and even by some who, from their education and profession, should have better understood him, and whose truest interest it certainly was laying aside needless disputations to have concurred according to all the obligations general and special, and the promoting together of him purity and spirituality of religion. The learned Lucas, Ofiander, a divine of Tbingem, was among these much taken notice of, by reason of a book of his written against him in the most satirical style called His Theological Connotations, and whereof he is said to have seriously repented when he came to die. It was not long before he was most solidly answered by Varenius, a juristic divine, in a piece entitled A Vindication of True Christianity. Nor were there wanting also some others of the more pious and candid Lutheran divines, who by their public writings and testimonies among the same time defended the cause of true religion and of his holy person. Some were Augustus of Holsteiner, D. Generis A. Danziger, 1 M.B. D. T.B. and Dior Scheus, a professor of Strasbourg, who wrote an epigram under his picture. He was an early trumpet about the time, which is not a little observable, when Germany was embroiled in intestine war for 30 years together, and the Protestant cause seemed to lie at stake. But God, when in the midst of his indignation, remembered his mercy and raised several eminent instruments of the truth, amongst which this was the most conspicuous. Even as in the present judgments of war and desolation, he has also remembered his covenant and excited many persons, both in Germany and in other countries, to bear a living and powerful testimony to the truth of Christianity, as originally delivered by its blessed founder. He was a man truly of deep fundamental piety, knowledge, and religion, and almost continuously exercising the blessed cross of our dear Savior. He had imbibed chiefly his doctrine and living way of practice from Thauler and Kempis, and all what he wrote was a scriptural style, and adapted to all, even the infants of Christ. And within a few years after him, Dr. Belthefar, and Meisner, professor at Wittenberg, who was deeply sensible of the great neglect of practical Christianity through the multiplying of disputes, and particularly of the stirs and motions raised against the aforesaid book of true Christianity, of whom it appears that he had laid a design of opening a practical college for the students of that university, or Collegium Pitatis, in which he had determined to treat concerning the way and manner of removing and correcting such things, either in church or state, as do really need the same. This is to be seen from his funeral program, as also from his PIA, then DESIDERIA, or Pious Breathings and Wishes for Reformation, published sometime after his death. Number 20. Next to him we may place Conradus, Horneius, a man of singular piety and zeal for God, who, insisting in the same steps and seriously laboring to promote real and practical Christianity, became suspected of not being orthodox in the article of justification, and so fallen into the odious of more rigid Lutherans, underwent by that means many severe oppositions and hardships. As also, not to insist here too long, did Dr. Andreas Kessler, superintendent of Kolberg, suffering much for his reproving the public abuses and vices, together with Dr. Arnus Mengerin, Mengeringaus, superintendent of Hall, and Dr. John Mathis Mayfar, professor and pastor of Effer, who, witnessing against the corrupt state of the universities, drew upon himself thereby the hatred of many of the learned men. Dr. John Smithinus, a professor at Strasbourg, noticed for his great moderation and piety. Dr. Justus Gesenius of Hanover, superintendent general, invidiously accused of Arminium. Solomon Gassius of Saxe Goth, whose verses upon Dr. Gerhardt, Gerhart, made some suspect him as a favor of fanaticism, and put him to the trouble of apologizing. The most candid Saubertus, whole moderation, when he could be taxed for nothing else, got him the character among the Lysias of a Syncretift, his disciple Dilherus, who by treading in his master's steps could not avoid the same censure. In John Valentine Andrea, the divine of Wartenberg, who had a very high veneration for the aforesaid Saubertus, and printed a book which he calls his Ghost, giving therein the character of the true Christian spirit and a faithful evangelical pastor. This Andreas, being a person of very piercing wit and understanding of solidarity, judgment, and prudence, and well exercised from his youth in all the affairs of religion, had such an insight into the state of Lutheran Church in particular as very few of his age had. But while having discovered the disease, he studied how to apply a remedy. He could expect no better than all others that went before him, of whom it is to be noted that one of the greatest lights that ever was in the church within a few years past publicly declared such a value for him in his writings as to say, that if he were to wish for any one to rise again from the dead, for the putting matters to right among them, and for the well settling the church, he should be a long while in deliberating whether he could find one to prefer before him. Besides these, there might also be mentioned D. Paulus and Tavernus, the eminent divine of Roftock, and Theophilus Grossenbacher, a deacon of the same church of Rostock, who in the year 1661 left the church a legacy at his death, which with the approbation of the faculty of the divines of that university and their prefix to it was then printed not without a great blessing. 'Tis called The Watchman's Voice, being written in High Dutch, and contains a discovery of the causes of the decay of Christian piety and of the unsuccessfulness of the Word of God and the sacraments in the evangelical churches for the promoting of real conversion in souls. Number 22. This is that book which, by God's blessing upon it, became the means of first opening the eyes of Dr. Spencer, Spener, and which made him to look more into what is solid and interior. By thereupon the next year frequently conferred with Dr. Raith, he being a very good divine, they leaving them both at Tubing, so that they had opportunities of freely discussing the subject of it, and of examining the causes of the abuses in the administration of the word and sacraments, and consequently of the little edification of the laity, together with the remedies fit to be applied. This was in the year 1662, and when some therefore have dated the rise of the whole affair, which has made such a noise in Germany for some years past. And about the same time at Roftock, there were Dr. Mueller, Dr. Lutkeman, and Dr. Quistorp, Jr., who both by their writing and preaching labored very much to prepare a way for the better state of the Church and for the advancement of solid piety in its members. The first of these suffered a great deal of contradiction by some of the more rigid Lutherans, on account of some expressions which he used in a sermon on 1 Corinthians 12, verse 2, and was thus, viz., our modern Christians and superficiality pretenders to religions have four dumb idols which they worship, and these are, number 1, the pulpit, number 2, the font, number 3, the altar, and number 4, the stool of confession, which put him to the trouble to apologize and to apply himself to some of the most eminent divines to have their determination, who then gave it in his favor and approved by this his expression, as whereby he only rejected the opus and then operatum, people too much dot on. He died in the year 1676, choosing for his funeral text Jeremiah 51 verse 9. The like did Dr. Courtholt under the name of Theophilus Sincerus, Sincerus. Dr. Hartmann, superintendent of Rothenburg, Reiferus, and several others. But as for Dr. Spencer, he became, as it were, the only soul in this cause. And having a deep inspection into the decayed lapsed state of Christendom, he wrote and published a book, long before the name of Pietism was brought into use, as being deeply affected with the sense thereof, called Pia and Desideria, wherein he shows evidently the apostate of the spouse of Christ with her first love, with the abuses and corruptions consequent hereof, and then proposes such manners by which the same might be of some manner redressed, among which one was this, that he caused to appear again such mystical and spiritual books of the best note as had been laid quite buried hitherto, and which could not but be true leading stars to the hidden path of life and the blessed imitation of Christ. Wherefore he published Toller's Postil with a Preface, a German theology, Arden's True Christianity, and Thomas à Kemp's, and failed not of his ends therein, in that both before the motions of Pietism, as also afterwards, many were disposed and induced by these to embrace the practice of true solid Christianity and the power of godliness. And since he was chosen of God for a peculiar instrument of the more practical Reformation, he was accordingly by divine providence put into such places where the Lord in his dark night of apostasy could best make use of him according to his pleasure. Hence it will be worthy of our observation to see what his main and principal work was in the three great places where he has been instructed by the pastoral care of the Lord's flock, Frankfurt, Dresden, and Berlin, where he was living since this narrative was in the press, and is newly departed hence, his works following him into eternity. Number 22, Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, whether he was called in the year 1666, he kept College Pietas, or exercises of piety, in his own house twice a week, where he gave first his own exposition of some chapter of the sacred Scripture, with suitable exhortations tending much to edification. Afterwards he allowed also others, whose mind and senses were exercising the Word of God, though not divines of profession, to bring forth any exercise or spiritual meditation that was upon their spirits, which having done under his directorship, was accompanied with a great heavenly blessing, so that he left there a seed of many pious and well-disposed people. When first this private college or meeting came to be opened, it was soon noised about, some praising and more blaming it. But Dr. Spencer, well knowing that a servant of God ought not to stick to go through evil report and good report, which apostolical expression was often heard to cite, when acquainted with the censures of others, was little hereafter concern. Abundancy of people coming to Frankfurt stock to this meeting intended for private devotion to hear what the meaning of this religious novelty, as they styled it, was, and although the most part went on no better principle or motive than that of mere curiosity, nay, or even on an ill design, nevertheless it has been observed that the Lord has made this an hour of visitation to many a soul upon hearing the convincing discourses both of the doctor and of some other good Christians there assembled, nay, even these who endeavored to suppress it blew up more and more the flame thereof, so that occasionally 'twas frequented by professors, superintendents, nay, by imperial, royal, electoral, etc. ministers, and now and then by persons of the best quality happening to come to town. Nay, further, the whole faculty of divines at KIELNHOLSATIA approved it, and by a particular responsivism or determination spoke in the favor of Dr. Spener, which provided no small discouragement to those who, in what they act and judge, are rather moved by academical determinations than by the very oracle of divine scripture. Number 23. In his public sermons, he preached here, 1676 and part of 1677, a whole year upon the necessity, as also probability of practical religion, showing hereby the great obstacles that are pretended to be altogether unable to hinder the advances of a willing mind. Now his peculiar character being candor and humility, with condescension even in the meanest of the households of God, whom he endeavored, as well as the high and great ones, to bring to a sense of piety. This made him go up and down to their houses, to instruct them in what is necessary to salvation. And because his moderation was so greatly eminent, he was there not only loved and esteemed by the Lutherans, but also by many of the Calvinists, of whom many came to frequent his church. But among what happened with him while he was at Frankfurt must not be omitted a passage worthy of our observation in this place, which is, that his tender care and love for the poor had then already so taken up his heart and head, that he was most busy in laboring and contriving how to set up a hospital to maintain them, in which enterprise he met at first with a great opposition from the magistrate, who upon his application to them answered they were incapable of maintaining such a number of poor. But he, not discouraged or beaten down by their denial, prevailed notwithstanding, and carried their consent by this argument, that if they had been able hitherto to maintain the poor in a confused and irregular way, through their going up and down in the streets, since none had yet starved for want of bread, how much more would they be able to do the same in a way more orderly and regular, which gained so much on them that the good doctor's desire and travel of his soul was answered. And this happened, success in so laudable a cause made him afterwards, when Professor Francke was about erecting his hospital, to cheerfully and ready in assisting him therein, as also in forwarding and promoting the same to his utmost capacity, in order to which he caused a sermon on the duties of the poor to be printed, which was dedicated to all the poor in Germany, and subjoined to the first edition of the professor's account of the orphan house. Number 24. Now, further seeing that Dr. Spener's work, which the Lord had cut out for him to do, was not to terminate in Frankfurt, and seeing also that a new period of a more universal reformation in the Church of God in general, as well as in the Lutheran in particular, was at hand, wherein he could further promote the cause of God and be a true laborer in his harvest, he was caused to Dresden to be the elector of Saxter's first chaplain, who, though he was unwilling to leave his beloved Frankfurt, as he calls it, God ordering it so in his holy providence, that upon the breaking out of Pietism, which happened not long after his settlement in this function, the instruments by whom God was pleased to raise it first, they being yet but young beginners in the practical part of religion, and either by students of divinity or masters of arts, might have some assistance and support from a grave and experienced divine, which they had indeed occasion for, who, by accustomed to the oppositions and difficulties which the enemy uses in lay in a way, might in like manner carry them through the same, and so be a considerable help and promoter of piety, for which he was also by the adversaries in way of derisions called the patriarch of the Pietism. This he knew nothing of in the beginning, when he was sent from Frankfurt, which was in the year 1686, that he might succeed Dr. Lucius in the court of Dresden. In the meantime, the elector John George III was no admirer at all of his public sermons, which were seasoned with the solid divine wisdom, and were most quick and piercing to the very heart, and much less still could be bear with his private visits, wherein he would hold him in an unpleasing conference and intercourse about his future state, dealing plainly and roundly with him as an ambassador of God and Christ, and manifesting the only way to true happiness both here and hereafter. For the House of Saxony, which had been hitherto the support and prompter of the Reformation, was then in the visible declension as to the matters of religion. But notwithstanding this indifferent reception at the said court, lest the grace of God and the call for which he was sent hither should prove fruitless, he begins here at Dustan to set up in his own house the catechisms of little children, which succeeded so well that he was quickly crowded with their numbers, whence followed reflections upon him from the university professors, who thought it unbecoming that such a man, both of great parts and learning, and withal in such an eminent station, should stoop to so mean and vile an employ in their eye as to the teaching and catechisms of children. But the doctors, little regard of this, saw well enough that the basil and groundwork of Reformation was to be laid in little children, old people being grown for the most part inflexible, unwilling to forsake the darling of their accustomed formalities or opinions, and therefore he counted rather be the true character of the real divine to feed both the sheep and the lambs of Christ. During his stay at Dresden, he published one of his most excellent pieces of practical divinity, wherein he did set forth the discriminating marks, whereby to discern the working of nature and grace from each other, which being a point of most needful observation to all ghostly pastors and teachers, and of great use to them on the account of their hearers, that so a just application may be made to their several states, he dedicated it to the clergy of Saxony in a sort of pastoral letter to their whole body, exhorting them to a faithful discharge of their duty in looking to the flocks committed to them. He published here also a set of Sunday sermons called Evangelical Duties, in which he endeavors to show the difference between the graces and virtues that are truly evangelical and do proceed from a principle of divine charity in the soul, and those that are merely external or but moral, which he dedicated to his present majesty, King Frederick of Prussia, then Elector of Brandenburg, who had sent him a vocation and commission, that he might accept of a prepositional or superintendent of some part of the Lutheran churches in his dominions, with which, as seeing the hand of God in it, he readily complied, especially also since the Elector of Saxony, being not over fond of his awakening sermons, was soon prevailed on to part with him. This set of sermons was printed in the year 1692 in 40. Number 24. In this new ministerial function he was scarce settled when it pleased God to increase and enlarge the new reformation of pietism, even in the large dominions of the then Elector of Brandenburg, and therefore it fell out about the same time that the new university at Halle in Saxony, belonging to Brandenburg, was projecting in a solemn manner inaugurated. Here now our Dr. Spencer was made again beneficial and useful, not only in bringing some of the principal authors of pietism that were little favored and persecuted in other dominions into Brandenburg, but they were gladly received in the new-founded University of Halle, but also having proved ever since no small promoter and supporter, both to the professors of divinity there, by the world called pietism, as also to all the pious foundations created there and elsewhere within the territories of that prince, yea, also much beyond them, and indeed to the whole Protestant Reformation in general, and the churches of the dispersion, till about the beginning of February in that present year, 1705. He received his quietus by the will of God, being sweetly translated, hence, as in the charity of divine love and peace, and leaving his name as a most fragrant perfume to posterity. Number 25. To this blessed man whom God wonderfully conducted through all the stages of his life, richly adorning him with the manifold graces of his Spirit, making him an instrument of blessing to nations and a father to many thousands, we owe under God that hopeful reformation in the first place, which spreads itself at present so victoriously not only in the territories of the King of Prussia, but in many other parts of Germany also, under the name of Pietism, and therefore, consequently, all those good fruits which have flowed thence, whereof certainly both the University of Halle and the Hospital of GLAUCHA are not the least inconsiderable. It may truly be said of him that he was a burning and shining light in his generation, and as God, in his infinite wisdom, was pleased to set up his light as it were in 3 candlesticks successively, so in each of these there was a peculiar dispensation and work, which was passed through, and without ever growing dim, it burned still brighter and brighter, the light being greater in the second than in the first, and in the third than in the second. In the first, what is called Pietism was but an embryo. In the second, it was born into the world and received its name. And in the third, it hath been nourished, having had a king for its nourishing father, whom may God long preserve to be a shield to his people, and a pattern of princes, under whom it now grows in stature, as it doth in favor both with God and man. In the second, it is said, it was born and received its name, and afterwards what manner this was, the reader shall now see in short, for to be very particular herein might fill up of itself a large history. Number 26. Some masters of art in the University of Leipzig had set up a private college or conference among themselves for the better understanding of the Scriptures and for the regulating both of the studies and conversation accordingly. This was called Collegium, capital Philobiblicum. And after the example of such like other exercises in the university, of which there were many kinds, in all the arts and sciences, there were also certain rules agreed on for the sake of order and method. They met together once a week, and in the beginning they had more a regard to learning than to the advancing of sincere piety. Their method generally was for one of the society to read a select portion out of the Old Testament in the Hebrew, or out of the New in Greek, or first one and then the other. And after he had explained the same, for the rest to add their observations likewise. The first part of the exercise was altogether critical for the finding out the literal meaning of the text, and this was their chief labor. The other part consisted in the deducing of propositions and uses from it. This was kept up for some time, with good successes, in a private chamber, after the evening service was ended on Sundays. But as the number of students frequently the same grew greater, and their zeal was more inflamed to the divine word, they could not continue as it was. And therefore, seeing that this their institution, contrary to their first intention, was become almost as good as public, they desired for their better conveniency to have now a director out of the order and faculty of divines, that might preside in these their meeting and regulate the same in the best manner. So also, upon application to him for this end, Dr. Valentine Alberti, Professor Extraordinary Divinity in the said university, readily accepts the charge offered to him, and the meetings are thereupon kept in his house, at which he himself is often present, assisted in these exercises and adding his own observations, both practical and theoretical. There is a great concourse presently of the students, and even among the professors themselves. Some openly encourage the same and honor new, and now and then with their presence this Philo-Biblical Society, as do also several travelers visiting the university. which whole matter being early communicated to Dr. Spencer a little before he removed into Saxony, he being very much pleased with the design, a confirmatory letter was written by him hereupon to the masters that were concerned in it, in which he not only fortified and encouraged them in their good resolution, but gave them also certain advices by means whereof all things might be better directed for Christian education and the advancement of solid piety. But this means in many was excited a vehement love for the study of the Holy Scriptures, an earnest desire to search into the depths of it, and a fervent breathing after the life of Christ with sincere endeavors to promote the ends of his holy religion, to which the method did very much conduce that was here observed. All was now begun and ended with prayer after the lecture, both explicatory and applicatory of the text. It was a custom for the director to add his monitions and counsels, the rest of the members to confer their observations, and even the students in auditories sometimes to propose their own. All this for the good while passed on very well, without raising any suspicion, but being generally rather commended and applauded as a most useful design. And from this sprung several other private exercises of the same nature among the students, by which the scripture learning was exceedingly cultivated. Mr. Francke, who had been one of the first authors of this exercise, but had been absent from the university for a year or two, in which time he visited Luxembourg and Hamburg, diligently insisting in both these places on the same sacred scripture, while what was here begun took still deeper and deeper rooting. After having spent some of the first months of the year 1689 at Dresden in the house of Dr. Spencer, who in all matters sufficiently instructed him, returned again to Leipzig, and there is not only joined a second time to the college and society aforesaid for the propagating of the knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, but he himself opened a fresh Bible school, as he had done before, just upon his taking his master's degree. He began with the Epistle of St. Paul to the Philippians, in which he succeeded even beyond his hope, the divine blessing accompanying his labors, wherein his principal aim was the reformation of his academical auditors, and powerfully to persuade as many as were content to take him as their tutor or master, that they should not take up only with the knowledge and learning that is needful to accomplish a good divine, but that sitting before themselves the primitive pattern, they should in all things study to behave themselves accordingly, as persons more particularly dedicated and consecrated to the service of the blessed Jesus. Being thus encouraged, he proceeded to read upon the epistle to the Ephesians, and after that upon the latter epistle to the Corinthians, whence he took occasion to set forth both the obstacles and the helps to the study of the divinity, and this with so much applause and so great a concourse of students that neither his own chamber nor the school of the electors scholars, which he had obtained for this end from the rector of the university, was able to hold the number of them. In the middle of the summer, Dr. Maebius, Dean of the Faculty of Divines, appointed him to read in his stead the public theological lectures for that season, according to custom, in the Divine School, at which lectures, called Cercales, he, reading upon the second epistle to Timothy, was flocked to in a most unusual manner, he being ordinarily about 300 auditors. Moreover, the masters, who were the members of the Philo-Biblical Society, being hereby mightily encouraged and excited, more steadily confirmed in their resolution for the uniting with the research of Scripture and the study of piety, and consulted all proper ways and methods to be taken for the same, under the conduct of the divine grace, according to what in these lectures had been most lively represented. Hereupon some of them met together privately in the fear of the Lord. Mr. Francke's study was the place pitched on for this purpose as most convenient, and here they gave themselves up diligently to sacred reading and meditation, with prayer, following the method of St. Paul in his epistle to Titus, which was for the use of the candidates of divinity expounded at this private exercise. But it was not permitted them to enjoy long this exercise alone, for many of the students, so soon as they heard of it, began to flock to it as much as to any other of the academical exercises. Number 26. At or about the same time, Mr. John Caspar, Scad, SCAD, of the country of Hindenburg, as a faithful fellow laborer in the world, was instant both publicly and privately in promoting this holy design. Wherefore, we read upon the first epistles of St. John and St. Peter, to the no small excitement and edification of his auditors, which were as many as the straightness of the place could bear, and not much less numerous than what followed Mr. Francke. In the year 1691 he was made deacon of St. Nicholas Church at Berlin, the rector whereof was Dr. Spener, Spener. He had, notwithstanding his youth, a deep insight into the great decay of the church, and spent his time much in categorizing of youth, for which he had a particular gift. He published a small treatise at Berlin called A Memorial for Berlin upon the words, LUC 19 v. 42, wherein he exhorts them to prevent by true repentancy the approaching judgments. In his last two sermons he foretold his death, commending to God the small flock of the pious as in a most serious and compassionate farewell, and exhorting them with a great deal of fervency to remain faithful. After he had preached his last sermon, a malignant fever seized him, with which his head being distempered, he, nevertheless, instead of talking in his delirium as is usual, a deal of idle and nonsensical stuff, spent his hours with praising of God and praying to him, and incessantly repeating some devout ejaculation or other. Thus he repeated some 100 times the following expressions: My Lord Jesus, Jesus, I live unto thee, I die unto thee, I belong to thee, I serve thee, my Jesus, I am thine. And all this he cried from out of all the strength of his life, and with so loud a voice as that in the neighboring houses it was heard, and people flocked together at his house, not knowing what to make hereof. Being told of this, and cautioned that he might not tire himself with crying so loud, he said, It does not tire me, I must cry and preach repentancy, while there is yet a gasp of breath in me. Oh, if I had but cried louder when I was in the pulpit, then I might now forbear it. At the beginning of his sickness he went through a vehement inward combat to his greater purification, but soon after he cried out, Victory, victory, I have fought with the devils and conquered them. Oh, let us sing eternal hallelujah. He was so fervent in categorizing and took such a pleasure in it that in the midst of his sickness he caused the flock of his little children to come before his bed, and having sung and prayed with them, he to finish them with blessing. Once also, when he observed that some of those that attended him were asleep, he said, See how securely they sleep, being a lively emblem both of the political and ecclesiastical and OECONOMICAL state, who are all fallen asleep, but the Lord is risen up to awaken them with a strong voice. A little before his death he prayed most fervently for the elector, the city, and his congregation, but especially for his successor in that place, wishing that the same might reap what had been sown by him. He died in the Lord 1698, in the 32nd year of his age. 27. But to return to the affairs of Leipzig. While Mr. Shade and Mr. Francke were so usefully employed in reading upon the apostolical epistles, many were inflamed with a holy zeal thereby, and just then, in the very warmth of these transactions, there comes unexpected, and is added to them as by a singular providency of God, Mr. Paul Anthony, being newly returned from his travels, he having accompanied in the quality of chaplain Duke Augustus, now Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, in his tour through France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, who having been a champion of Mr. Francke a few years before and had assisted in laying the foundation of the Philo-Biblical College, and therefore now with all cheerfulness unites himself with Mr. Schade and him in this undertaking, to whom also soon after joined Mr. Achilles. He then, being much affected with the zeal and ardent love of the scholars for the study of the Scriptures, took in hand St. John's Gospel, and in the Prince's College, of which he was fellow, expounded the same, with a mighty concourse also of the students, equal if not superior to any of the rest. After which he in like manner expounded St. Paul's first epistle to Timothy, with the same applause and satisfaction of his auditors. He was after this called to several preferments in the Lutheran Church, but is at present an adornment of the University of Hull, and the Faculty of Divines there. Number 28. Now, upon the opening of these biblical schools or exercises, the students of divinity, who had been wont before to frequent none but either the philosophical or the homiletic schools, gave themselves so up to the study of the Bible, so these were little followed. The latter of these were a sort of exercises in which the art of preaching was chiefly taught, and of which at one time there were no less than 30 at Leipzig, the great abuses whereof were taken notice of and sharply reprehended by some eminent divines as an impediment to solid theological learning. For the candidates of the divinity, being herein bred up to a superficial smattering in divine matters, and to an empty and fallacious oratory, made little or no progress in true and genuine theology, or would take much pains in searching the originals whence it flows. But now, instead of thinking it enough to fill handsomely a pulpit and to act thence the orator, so as to draw into admiration a vulgar oratory by the help of some camp theological or metaphysical terms, with a little vain rhetoric and jiggling music of words, most of the students of divinity were convinced of the necessity of applying themselves to the original books themselves, where are the springs of all sacred and solid learning, with much more diligence than hitherto had been customary in the university. Nay, several would hardly read any other books besides, and these were so brought up in the originals as the booksellers' shops were hardly able to supply what was called for, especially the Greek editions of the New Testament. Another consequence was this, that it was complained of hereupon earnestly by some, that theological, metaphysical, and homiletic schools were no longer frequented as before, which could not possibly be, since so great a part of the students did daily employ several hours in these sorts of exercises on the Holy Bible. It fell out also by the means hereof that several young students, who, though they professed the study of divinity, did nevertheless walk after the manner of the world, being now awakened and convinced by the power of the divine word, which they met with in those lectures and exercises, began henceforth forward to lead a serious and sober life, with all the diligence and carefully to direct their studies to God's greater glory and to the good and welfare of the Church in a more eminent manner. Now from some that frequented these pious exercises out of a vain curiosity, being unregenerate in their lives and not able to bear the admonitions given them, first the masters, they were members of the Philo-Biblical Society, then the hearers of Mr. Francke, and lastly, as many as constantly frequented any of these schools or exercises and entered upon another course of life more suitable to the principles and spirit of Christianity, were in derision called pious. Number 29. This new name being coined, there was no more to do with the adversaries, but straight to search out some heretical opinions to affix on them, which is no hard matter to do at any time. To speak of abuses crept in was presently interpreted a contempt of the holy institutions themselves, and calculate holiness of life was looked as an asserting our salvation by works, and to press after a vital knowledge of God, as distinct from a dead one, was represented as altogether fanatical. Now upon the many suggestions and calamities they were confidently reported up and down, Mr. Francke made his application to the Dean of the Faculty, requesting that he might have leave to hear and examine in the first place in the case of any further accusations of heterodoxy against him and the rest. But this now being then granted, the clamorers grew more violent and hot, though the interest mainly of some of the professors who, seeing their school but little frequented, were much exasperated hereat, and especially at the sight cast upon them by some of the junior students. So the theological faculty, by their dean, summons Mr. Francke to give an account of his proceedings and an answer to the charge against his new sort of lectures or colleges set up, which he did so much to satisfaction, as the said dean, seeming well contented, promised to acquaint his brethren of the faculty with his answer, who from that time desisted from any further prosecuting the inquiry that had begun. This was all in the summer of the year 1689, but the motion still increased, for the pulpits began to ring from this new sect, and from the consistory of the clergy, awakened to this by a multitude of rumors, comes forth a mandate to the University of Leipzig, bearing date August the 32nd, in the same year, requiring them to make a strict inquisition into the matter of fact, from the names the pietists were derived and what their manners, doctrines, and studies were. On the other hand, the Theological College of Leipzig presented the consistory a memorial of what had passed with respect to Mr. Francke and the other students of divinity, therewith declaring how some opinions were broached by them that might have dangerously consequences, and what they should further do to examine into the matter thoroughly, for which end they had resolved to interdict these lectures, which were accordingly interdicted, and another mandate soon followed for bringing the cause to Drisdam, by which means this whole matter came to be better examined into and taken notice of. The electoral court in the whole province of Saxony is filled with the rumors of it, and in a little while after all Germany. Books are written on both sides. Apologies and anti-apologies came forth thick. The new name of Pietism is by the heretic mongers inserted into their blacklist, and the first instruments of Pietism were banished from Leipzig. Number 30. But since God purposed that this new reformation should spread further, he ordered it so that Mr. Francke was gladly received by Dr. Breithaupt, then Professor of Divinity and Superintendent of Erfurt, ERFURT, in THURINGIA, who being a person not only addicted to solid piety from his youth upwards, but also of great experience, learning, and knowledge in spiritual things, wanted but an opportunity of being supported and assisted, the better to push on a more practical reformation. And therefore, seeing the wonderful hand of God in all what had been transacted hitherto with Mr. Francke and his fellow laborers at Leipzig, he promoted him to the pastorate of St. Augustine in Erfurt, where now by union of these two divine instruments a marvelous revolution and change was wrought in the said great city of Erfurt, both by the powerful word of their preaching and by Mr. Francke's catechizing of little children, who, being crowded with great multitudes of them, succeeded therein to admiration, as also by the ministry of those students, that upon their being first awakened at Leipzig flocked hither in great numbers, and were taken by the Lutheran citizens of Erfurt into their houses in order to tutor their children and educate them in true fundamental piety and the fear of the Lord, so that at last the Roman Catholic magistrate, being jealous of this unusual applause, resolution, and motion, and apprehensive lest a new sect should encroach and creep in there, referred the whole cause of the pietism to the elector of Mentz, M-E-N-T-Z, who carried their fears, superstitions, and accusations so far that by a mandate from the said elector of Mentz, to whom the city of Erfurt belongs, all spiritual exercises were stopped and interdicted. And after some little while, both Dr. it's Breithaupt, and Mr. Francke were obliged to leave their city and territories. After this, in the year 1691, by Dr. Spencer's removal to Berlin, the face of affairs began much to change, and the persecuted to breathe a little freely, in that Mr. Breithaupt was called by the court of Berlin to the professorship in divinity at the University of Halle, which was then but newly founded, and Mr. Francke, receiving likewise a call thither, was chosen to be the professor of the Oriental languages and pastor at Glaucha near Halle. And it was as it was in the time of the Reformation of Luther, that as soon as he appeared at the head of the Reformation, many began to be raised and awakened both in Sefferland and France. So likewise here, after the first motion of Leipzig, some were in like manner stirred up at Lutenberg, Hall, Bergstedt, Wolfenbüttel, Goth, and in other places, who unanimously labored in their respective places for a practical reformation, and more than superficial piety and spirituality, but received at the two first places a very sorry treatment, which ended at last in an utter banishment of all pietism thence. Number 31. But it must not be forgotten here that as in the aforesaid Reformation began by Luther, so also in this, amidst the variety of subjects there entertained it, being not alike prepared, certain excesses and abuses did insinuate themselves, and tares were sown among the good wheat, all which was presently charged on the first instruments of this new Reformation, who have soberly and solidly vindicated themselves on this head. And thus the evil, which the malice of the adversary hereby designed, has been made to work for an abundant good. Dr. Antonius, in his programs to the students for Whitsuntide 2 years since, as pro-rector then of the University at Halle, taking notice then of this artifice of the enemy to hinder the progress of the work of God, very warmly expostulates the injustice and unreasonableness of such a proceeding. But how unjust is this, and how impious! For who but a madman would charge Christ with the guilt of Judas? Or who would blame the apostles and the godly presbyteries of the church at Ephesus for that out of their own selves there did men arise speaking perverse things, and there did thereby, as the apostles had before testified, drew away apostles after them? And afterward he makes his most solemn appeal to the whole body of the students, that they might be witnesses both of what they heard and saw, and judge what manner of credit was to be given to the several particulars, as about justification by faith, the life of the sacraments, etc., vulgarly charged against the promoters of Christian learning and piety in the university, which is indeed worthy of being transcribed here whole, for the neatness as well as solidness of it. But this would be too far to transgress the bounds here set us, and this may serve at present, by way of introduction to the following narrative, to give an idea of what is called pietism, and to let the reader into an account of the manner of its rise. For to write a history on it would be at least to fill a volume as large as this. Number 32. However, it must not be omitted that the cause of the persecutions of this account, both in Saxony and in some other parts of Germany, was principally this, viz., when the first instruments of pietism, so-called, came to be sensible where the root of the apostasy did lie, and the decay of Christian piety and corruptions, both in rites and doctrines, did generally spring for the most part from them that made a gain of godliness in the worst sense, and who climb into the sheepfold of Christ, not by the true door, but either by the way of mere scholastical learning and unsanctified reason, or by application of worldly patrons and other unlawful and sinister means. They did not but declare what they found and knew to be true. They saw raw, unexperienced, unexercised students in the cross of Christ, entrusted with the pastoral care of souls, while they themselves were often stupidly ignorant of the state of their own souls, and destitute of all the requisite qualifications of a true Christian pastor, by witnessing against which they drew presently to themselves the odom of the guilty, which produced several persecutions, not only what was done at the courts of Saxony and Luxembourg, in order to suppress this growing sect, as they called it, of pietism, are more than sufficient evidence of this matter. But besides, there are numerous other instances also, which might for confirmation of this be brought both from other courts of Germany, as also, not to mention the sufferers, that of Sudan itself. And no wonder it is, if in the midst of so much dust as was raised, several even of these soberers or more religious part were at first afraid of them, and were carried away with the multitude to think and speak evil of them. The refugees that fled from other provinces of Germany for shelter into the marches of Brandenburg were also attacked again, as they had been before, by the violency of many of the clergy strongly prejudiced against them. But when the slanderings and accusations from the pulpit grew daily hotter and hotter, and the rumor thereof was spread even to the electoral court of Berlin, several commissions were issued out for examining into the truth of the matters charged against them, which all turned to the disadvantage of the adversaries and for the justification of the truth. But chiefly the last commission of all, to which a certain sermon of Professor Francke gave birth, which he preached and printed against the false prophets. For when he spoke out plainly that the general degeneration of Christianity was owing principally to the lukewarmness and deadness of the clergy, they were so offended at it as by aggravating hence their gravamina and complaints very much at the royal court of Prussia, to necessitate the king to appoint a public commission for inquiring into the reports and grounds of all their accusations, but which fell out so favorable on the part of the pietism, contrary to their expectations, as the accusers were silenced and confounded, and whereby as the pietism were chiefly accused and charged by the anti-pietism with heterodoxy. These delegates and commissioners did search into and examine most strictly, impartially, their doctrine, whereby they found what was taught by them to be perfectly conformable to the symbolic books and the Augustan confession of faith. And since that time they have been, and are still, protected, continuous and favored by the Prussian magistrate, who has confirmed the foundations at Hull with many privileges, as from this book and the appendix is made to appear. Section 5. It's hoped the precedent account will not be altogether ungrateful to the English reader, who would not have been necessary where these things are known and understood better, and may afford no inconsiderable light towards the tracing the footsteps of a divine providence in this most peculiar work here described, but yet further to give a more perfect information of this whole affair, where is an appendix added to this edition, into which we have inserted some pieces of moment relating both of the rise and progress of this most famous seminary of piety and learning, besides the charter of the hospital, the decoration of the same, and some letters of the elector. Here is the scheme which is observed in managing the foreign and accidental poor there, together with the rules by which the charity schools are ordered. The present state of the divinity faculty at Hull is pretty fully expressed in an abstract of a letter written by a person who had full knowledge thereof, and sent to a foreign friend, and because of the late decease of Dr. Spencer at Berlin, a principal instrument under God of the many pious and charitable institutions effectually at this time promoted by the industrious zeal of the so-called pietism divines, may afford seasonable matter of reflection both to friends and adversaries, it was thought not amiss to add an extract likewise of a letter which contains a brief account of his last hours that are certainly very edifying. It might have been added too that the king his master regretted his loss in a manner very uncommon, honoring and mourning over him as a father. Some of the papers which were designed to enter into this collection being omitted, that the bulk of the book might not swell too much, which yet it has done nevertheless beyond what was at first expected. As for the character of the style, it would not in any wise answer the original, were it not in the greatest simplicity. If any teutonisms or other imperfections are found in it, it's hoped that not many will be offended hereat, but will look at the substance, which needs not a spacious covering of words. Also, the version being made by a German, the candidate reader will easily make allowance for some little trips in the manner of the expression, as also in the deduction of the German coin into English. Upon the whole, little or nothing has been left undone that could be thought material to render this edition as complete as it was in our power to make it, ardently wishing and praying to Almighty God that it may meet with at last an equal success here and in the language of his kingdom to what it has met with abroad in other languages wherein it has hitherto appeared. Now, among the many wonderful instances of divine providence, besides those recorded in this book, and are of a most fresh date, with which our most merciful Father has favored both this orphan house and the historical account of it, both in the origin and in the translation, we shall insert here but one or two that are the most remarkable, as newly transmitted hither by a letter from Hall bearing date March 29, 1705, and faithfully extracted hence from further satisfaction and encouragement therein. The first is of a certain honorable lady, who by reading of the formal account of the orphan house or hospital, was by it awakened and stirred up in much a manner, as she ran in all haste to her jewels, being resolved to present the orphan house with what first came to her hands. It happened now that it was a gold piece of 33 ducats in weight, and the same person who sent this was sent also since at different times 2 other such great pieces of gold. Moreover, another person sends a rose noble, and there together with it these following words written: Here presents itself a small gift as a fruit of the footsteps of the loving and faithful God, yet living and governing, to the service of the orphan house, yet flourishing by the blessing of God. The pursuit of the footsteps has left behind such footsteps and such traces in me, as for which I shall and must praise God eternally. I can assure you indeed that I never went to the reading of a new paragraph, but what a large flood of tears thereat trickled down from my cheeks, seeing that I found in it that goodness of God which is new every morning. It would be too long to relate all the good operations of the footsteps of God which I could tell you, except of this little as a real testimony from a soul that is desirous of help. Look not to the gift, but to the mind of the giver. The widow's little mites are by far more precious in the eyes of God than the most vast treasures of the rich. Include me but in your prayers, and then I have got what I aimed at. As now in these last words mentioned has been made, of those extraordinary moments which have been raised in a soul by the account of the manifest blessings of God in the orphan house, so likewise many other instances of the same nature could be easily brought in. But among all this that follows seems the chiefest and most principal, and therefore can no wise be omitted, as likewise because it more nearly relates to and confirms the title as in this present edition. The story is thus a certain student of the civil law, whose mind was possessed with manifold athetical notions, was not long since, by reading the footsteps, which he had only taken into his hand to pass away the time with, touched and struck in such a manner as he began not only to cry and weep very bitterly, not being able to refrain himself, even in the presence of others, from shedding of many tears and loud lamentations for a good while together, but was also really brought to himself into a sober and settled sense of his condition, insomuch that he discovered to a certain Christian man his atheistical mind and godless life, which he had led hitherto, and entered hereupon, by the grace of God, into a serious combat of repentancy, to the no small joy of many pious hearts. O let every one love, bless, and adore our God that reads this, and let every soul lay prostrate before these footsteps of his divine goodness and most wise providence. Surely this now is no dead, but a living demonstration indeed of the existence of a deity in the world, and of his particular as well as general care in the government of it, which in the reading of the following sheets will more evidently appear to the glory of his most holy name. Amen. End of the Preface, having been read by Peter John Preface.